The conference room buzzed with a dull hum as the overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly. It was nearly 9 a.m., and the air in the room was thick with stale coffee and the faint scent of leftover lunches. Vanessa Carter sat at the edge of the long rectangular table, a stack of papers neatly arranged before her, her laptop open but untouched. She was the only one not speaking. The others, Mark, the brash sales lead, Lisa, the overly confident HR manager, and Greg, the CTO with his constant smirk, were locked in their usual rhythm, talking over each other as though the meeting had been tailor-made for them. She'd been in this meeting countless times, but today felt different. Maybe it was the way Mark threw out ideas without even glancing in her direction, or how Lisa only pretended to listen when Vanessa spoke up. This was nothing new. They never really saw her, not as anything more than the quiet one in the corner. Vanessa could feel the cool hum of the projector behind her, the faint sound of the clock on the wall ticking with a precision that made her feel even smaller. They hadn't asked for her input yet, not once. They were too busy debating who had the best idea, who should take the lead on the upcoming project, all the while completely ignoring the woman who had been running the show in the shadows for years. Her thoughts drifted to the last few months, where she'd spent late nights organizing, planning, fixing what they didn't care to. She always did. She cleared her throat, a slight, almost imperceptible noise, hoping to draw some attention. But no one noticed. They kept talking. Mark's loud voice filled the air again. "We need someone who's been in the trenches, who knows how to push the product out there in a way that gets attention. Something new." His eyes locked onto Greg, who nodded like a bobblehead, both of them agreeing as though Vanessa wasn't even present. She felt the familiar, quiet sting of being invisible. The years of dedication, the moments she'd quietly gone above and beyond, only to be dismissed when it counted. It was like this every time, at the company picnics, during meetings, even at the casual office chats by the water cooler. She was just the person who got things done, no acknowledgement, no credit. Vanessa's fingers curled around the edge of her coffee mug, the warmth a small comfort against the coldness creeping through her. They didn't understand what it was like to be constantly overlooked. The weight of it never quite leaves her shoulders. But the strangest thing was that, even in this moment, as they dismissed her, she didn't feel defeated. No, there was a fire beginning to flicker inside her. Something quiet, steady, but undeniable. She could feel it, something shifting. Her gaze drifted down to the stack of papers in front of her. She had ideas. She always did. But in this room, her words never seemed to land. They always glossed over her, as if what she had to offer wasn't worthy of their time. They were too busy chasing their own reflections in the mirror of their own voices. A part of her wanted to stand up, slam her fist on the table, demand their attention, tell them what they were missing. But she knew that wouldn't work. Anger would only give them more reason to dismiss her. The truth was simpler, quieter. They didn't need to hear her. Not yet. The meeting continued, but Vanessa didn't hear their voices anymore. Instead, she found herself focusing on the rhythm of her breath, the subtle hum of the lights above, the way the clock ticked each second away. She remembered the day she first joined this company, how she'd been hopeful, eager to prove herself, ready to make a difference. Back then, they called her the new blood, full of energy, ambition, and ideas. But ambition, she had learned, was often seen as a threat in a world where mediocrity thrived. Slowly, the newness had worn off. She wasn't the newcomer anymore. She was just another cog in the wheel, overlooked and underappreciated. A slight shift in the air snapped her back to the present. She hadn't realized it, but the conversation had died down. They were all looking at her now. For the first time, someone had noticed. Greg cleared his throat, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. "Vanessa, what do you think about this proposal?" His voice was almost condescending, like he was doing her a favor by including her in the conversation. Vanessa met his gaze, her eyes steady, betraying none of the hurt that had flickered in her chest. She could feel her pulse quickening, but she fought to keep her face neutral, calm. "It's solid," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think it could be better." We need to focus on the long-term vision, not just quick wins. Otherwise, we'll be here every year, having the same conversation." There was a pause, the room quiet for a beat too long. No one spoke. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Lisa looked at Vanessa like she had just uttered nonsense. "I'll write that down," Greg muttered before turning away. The conversation moved on, leaving her words to dissipate into the air like smoke. But at that moment, Vanessa made a choice. She wouldn't stay small. She wouldn't let them forget her. The next move, the one that would turn everything on its head, was already set in motion. The quiet resolve in her chest grew. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Vanessa glanced up at the clock. Another minute passed. She straightened her back, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper before her. In that fleeting second, a decision was made. It was time. The time had come for her to rise from the shadows and claim what was hers. Quietly, steadily, she would take her place at the table, not as an afterthought but as the one who held the cards. The next few days felt like a quiet storm brewing. Vanessa could feel the shift in the air even before it happened. The subtle undertones of mockery, the fleeting glances from her colleagues that lingered just a moment too long. It was Tuesday morning, and she was in the break room, refilling her coffee. The rhythmic drip of the machine filled the silence, and she tried to focus on that, but it wasn't enough to block out the voices from the next room. Vanessa's idea for the new campaign? So safe. Honestly, it's like she doesn't want to risk anything. Mark's voice was loud, almost too loud for a conversation that wasn't meant for public ears. Lisa laughed. "Safe is right. We need someone who's willing to take a chance, not just play it safe. Who knows? Maybe we should put her in charge of the office holiday party next year." The laughter that followed wasn't warm. It wasn't even polite. It was the kind of laugh that stung, sharp and cutting. Vanessa's hand froze over her coffee mug. She could feel the heat of it, but it didn't touch her. Not really. Her fingers curled around the ceramic, the warmth grounding her. She could have said something, could have turned around and confronted them, could have silenced them with her words, but she didn't. Not yet. Vanessa took a breath, keeping her back to the door, letting the sounds of their conversation roll over her like rain. She heard Lisa's voice again, tinged with amusement. Poor Vanessa. If only she knew how much more she could do with a little push. Maybe she just doesn't want it badly enough. Or maybe she knows her place, Mark added, his voice dripping with arrogance. A rush of heat spread through Vanessa's chest, but she didn't react. She didn't turn around and snap at them. She had learned long ago that reacting only fueled the fire. Instead, she calmly set the coffee mug back down and walked out of the break room without a word. The hallway felt endless as she walked back to her desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The echoes of their voices followed her, but she didn't let it show. On the outside, she was composed, professional, walking like someone who had nothing to prove. But inside, something was stirring, something she hadn't felt in years, something that wasn't defeated. It was on fire. At her desk, she opened her laptop, staring at the screen for a few moments. The proposals for the new project sat there, waiting for her input. She glanced at the clock. Another hour before the next meeting. Another hour before she'd be dismissed again. But not this time. The phone on her desk rang, and she jumped, startled out of her thoughts. It was her accountant, checking in about the latest numbers for her investments. The conversation felt like a small oasis, a brief break from the silent storm raging inside her. They talked numbers for a few minutes, but as the conversation ended, something clicked. The investments she had been making for years, quiet, behind the scenes, had reached the point where they were no longer just side projects. She didn't need this job anymore. She never had. The realization hit her with a clarity she hadn't anticipated. All those years of playing second fiddle, of biting her tongue, of waiting for a break. None of it mattered anymore. She had built something of her own, and it was time to let the world see it. By the time the meeting rolled around, Vanessa was ready. She didn't bother with the usual coffee cup or the small talk before the conference room. Today, she walked in with purpose, her posture straight, her gaze focused. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and she was no longer afraid of it. Mark and Lisa were already at the table, talking over each other as usual. But as Vanessa entered the room, the energy shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. It was just a subtle change, the kind you could almost feel in your bones. They didn't stop talking, but there was an awareness in their eyes as they glanced at her. They hadn't expected this. "Vanessa, what's up?" Greg asked, glancing up at her with that same lazy, dismissive look. "You've got something to say?" She could see the condescension in his eyes, the same way he always dismissed her. But this time something was different. Vanessa's lips curved into a faint smile. "Actually, I do," she replied, her voice steady, calm. She could feel the weight of the moment, and for once, she wasn't afraid. Not of them, not of the judgment. She stood at the front of the room, her fingers resting lightly on the table. "I've been thinking about this project," she continued, her voice unwavering. "But I've realized something." Mark looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Oh? And what's that?" "I think the problem isn't the project. It's the people running it." A beat of silence. Vanessa let the words hang in the air. Mark opened his mouth to retort, but she kept speaking, her tone firm. "You've all been so focused on the small wins, the easy choices. You've ignored the bigger picture, and that's why we're stuck. All of you," she gestured to the group, "are stuck." They stared at her, unsure of how to respond. She could feel the tension building, but she didn't back down. This was her moment, and it wasn't about fighting with words. It was about showing them. "I'm the one who's been holding this company together. Quietly. Behind the scenes," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And now it's time for you all to see exactly what I've built." Greg's expression faltered. Lisa shifted in her seat, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. But Vanessa didn't wait for their response. She pulled out a single sheet of paper from her bag and laid it on the table. The room fell silent as they all leaned forward, eyes scanning the document. It was the deed to the company. "I'm the new owner," Vanessa said simply, her voice cold and precise. Effective immediately. The room went still. For the first time, no one spoke. There was no laughter, no mockery, just silence. Vanessa felt a calmness wash over her, a deep, still peace. She hadn't done this for revenge. She hadn't done this to prove them wrong. She had done it because she was tired of being overlooked. The power didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to her. The next few days were filled with an air of quiet disbelief. Vanessa's announcement had shaken the company in ways she hadn't fully expected. The atmosphere in the office had changed from one of routine indifference to palpable confusion. It wasn't just that they hadn't seen it coming. None of them had even bothered to look. They had no idea who she truly was, what she had been capable of, or the power she had quietly amassed behind closed doors. The reactions varied, of course. Some were silent, their jaws hanging open, unable to process the sudden shift in the power dynamic. Others, like Mark and Greg, were in denial, trying to salvage whatever dignity they could after being outed as utterly blind to Vanessa's true role. Lisa, however, was different. She sat in the back, quietly watching. Her eyes narrowed in thought as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle she had long ignored. Vanessa, for her part, did nothing to entertain their confusion. She had no desire to explain herself, no need to justify the choices she had made. She had been overlooked for far too long, and now it was her time to sit at the head of the table. Not just as a leader, but as the one who held the cards. Back in her office, Vanessa leaned back in her chair and looked out of the window, watching the world outside. It was a bright spring day, the sunlight filtering through the blinds in soft, horizontal rays. The city buzzed beneath her, people hurrying about their daily lives, unaware of the change that had just rippled through this small company. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. It had taken years of careful planning, years of building trust, earning respect, and quietly making strategic moves. Every choice, every decision had been deliberate. And now, here she was, sitting in a space she had carved out for herself without anyone even noticing. Vanessa had never been one to shout her accomplishments. She had always preferred to work in the background, blending in with the walls, invisible yet essential. But now, she was going to show them what it meant to underestimate her. She wasn't here to take their place. She was here to create her own. For the first time in years, Vanessa felt a surge of power course through her. It wasn't the kind of power that came with recognition or applause. No, this was a quieter, more subtle power. The kind that ran deep, buried beneath the surface, waiting to be tapped when the time was right. And now the time was right. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a text message from her accountant. The numbers had come in for the latest investments she had quietly moved behind the scenes. An acquisition here, a strategic purchase there. They were all paying off. The stock market was shifting, and her portfolio was growing at an unprecedented rate. This wasn't just about owning a company. This was about building something that would last. Vanessa's fingers hovered over the screen as she read the message. It wasn't the first time she'd seen this kind of news. She had built her wealth slowly and steadily, each investment carefully placed. But this time, the stakes felt different. She wasn't just a passive observer of her wealth anymore. She was its architect. She smiled to herself, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't just about proving herself to her colleagues. This was about her, about the quiet victories she had achieved on her own, away from the eyes of those who never thought to look. But the work wasn't done yet. Later that day, Vanessa called a meeting with her inner circle, the team she had built quietly, piece by piece, over the years. There was no need for a grand announcement, no need for fanfare. They knew what was coming. They had known all along. One by one, they filed into her office. Claire, her longtime assistant who had helped with the administrative side of things. Jamil, the head of finance who had been instrumental in some of the quiet acquisitions. And Dana, the marketing strategist who had always pushed for bold moves, even when others hesitated. Vanessa motioned for them to sit, and they did, all eyes on her. There was no need for introductions, no need for small talk. They all knew their roles. They had been part of this journey long before the meeting room was filled with the surprise of Vanessa's announcement. Claire spoke first, her voice calm but carrying a weight of concern. "Vanessa, are you sure you want to do this now?" They're still in shock. There's going to be resistance. We're going to need a strategy, a clear one. Vanessa leaned forward, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I've been planning for this for years, Claire. There's no turning back now." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "The time for caution is over. We have to move quickly. We can't let this slip through our fingers." Jamil nodded. "The numbers are in our favor, but we're going to need to take control of the narrative. People are going to talk. They'll try to twist the story, to undermine your position." Dana, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "It's not just about taking control of the narrative. We need to show them. We need to make sure they know we're not here to play games." Vanessa's eyes met hers, and she nodded slowly. "Exactly. We show them. We don't have to say anything. We just act." The following week, Vanessa set the wheels in motion. The board meeting was scheduled, and the stakes were high. But she wasn't worried. This wasn't a battle she needed to fight with words. The work had already been done. All she had to do now was step forward and claim what was hers. She spent the days leading up to the meeting in preparation. It wasn't about building new alliances or rallying support. It was about securing her position. The legal paperwork was already in place. The financials were solid. All that was left was to walk into that room and let them see the truth. On the morning of the meeting, Vanessa arrived early. She walked into the boardroom and surveyed the table, noting the empty chairs that would soon be filled with the same people who had never seen her as more than the office manager. Today, they would see her differently. As the members filed in, they exchanged nervous glances. Greg took his seat at the head of the table, a place that had always been reserved for the CEO. But Vanessa didn't care. The power wasn't in the seat. It was in the work she had already done. She was already in control. When the meeting started, she said nothing at first. She simply waited, watching as the tension built in the room. They were waiting for her to speak, to explain herself. But she didn't need to explain anything. When the moment finally came, she stood up. The silence in the room was thick, and she could feel every set of eyes on her. "I'm not here to negotiate," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm here to take what's mine." The rest of the meeting was a blur of whispers, confusion, and disbelief. But Vanessa wasn't concerned. The deals had already been made. The position was hers. There was no going back now. As she walked out of the room, the weight of her decision settled over her. She had done it. She had built something real, and now it was time for the world to see it. The following weeks passed with a strange mix of tension and anticipation in the office. Vanessa's announcement had turned the world upside down for her colleagues. But for her, it felt almost like an exhale after holding her breath for years. There were still obstacles ahead, people to convince. Varied as they were predictable. Greg's reaction had been the most predictable. Sheer denial. He had spent the last several years positioning himself as the face of the company, despite the fact that it had always been Vanessa pulling the strings behind the scenes. His arrogance had been his downfall, but it hadn't crushed his need to keep fighting for relevance. He tried to undermine her at every turn, small, petty remarks, attempts to push his ideas on the team, and the occasional sidelong glance filled with thinly veiled contempt. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir the pot. Lisa, on the other hand, took a different approach. She was far too calculating to be caught off guard. She began weaving whispers through the office, careful to remain behind the scenes, crafting a narrative that painted Vanessa as someone who had cheated her way to the top. She knew the power of perception, and she was ready to exploit it. Lisa would wait until the moment was right, then strike with a story, a rumor, anything that could shake Vanessa's newfound position. She thought it was just a matter of time before the house of cards came tumbling down. And then there was Mark. He had taken a slightly more direct approach, at least outwardly. When Vanessa first made her move, he had spent a few days trying to rally support, calling a few meetings with department heads, checking in with those who might still be on his side. The team had watched him carefully, some confused by his sudden push for unity, others amused by his sudden sense of purpose. They knew the game Mark was playing. They could almost see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to position himself as Vanessa's ally. Despite how things had shaken out, he wasn't fooling anyone. Vanessa noticed all of this, of course. She saw the whispers and the attempts to plot against her, but she didn't react. Not right away. She had learned long ago that people like Greg, Lisa, and Mark only became dangerous when they saw that you feared them. And she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The real test came during an executive meeting. It was scheduled late on a Friday afternoon, and it had a strange, almost hostile energy hanging over it. The purpose of the meeting was ostensibly to discuss company growth strategies for the next quarter, but Vanessa knew the real reason everyone had gathered. They were trying to figure out how to manage her. She had walked into the room with the same quiet confidence she always carried. No longer the timid employee who spent too much time listening. No, now she was the one who held the key. And she knew it. The meeting started with the usual pleasantries. Greg fumbling through his stack of papers, Lisa flipping through her phone, Mark chiming in occasionally. But it didn't take long for the conversation to turn. "So, Vanessa," Greg began, his voice smooth and calculated, "we've been hearing from some of the department leads that things feel unsettled. Your leadership style is a bit untraditional. Some people are struggling with the way things have changed so suddenly." Vanessa didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. "Untraditional?" she asked, her voice calm, not hostile but deliberate. "Or perhaps you mean that they've never been challenged before. I'm not here to make people feel comfortable, Greg. I'm here to make the company work." There was a subtle shift in the room. Some of the other executives shifted in their seats, unease spreading like wildfire. Vanessa could feel it, the rising tension that was building as Greg tried to push her back down into the corner she had occupied for so long. But it wasn't working. She wasn't the same person anymore. "That's not what I mean," Greg said. his voice faltering slightly. "It's just that people are used to the way things were before. There's been a lot of turnover. We don't want to cause more instability." Vanessa leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table, a gesture that was both subtle and commanding. "What's unstable, Greg, is the way you've been running this place. Everyone here has been too busy chasing after the next best idea without thinking long-term. Now, we need to focus. We need to build on what works, and we need to stop being afraid of making decisions that actually move us forward." Greg's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but Vanessa didn't give him the chance. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to make her look like an outsider, someone who didn't fit the mold. He was trying to force her into a corner, but she wasn't playing his game. "Enough of the small talk," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I didn't come here to discuss feelings or concerns. We're going to lay the groundwork for this company's future today, right now." She paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room. "You're all here because you're the ones who will make this happen. But make no mistake, this is my company now. If you're not with me, you're against me." The room fell silent. The impact of her words hung in the air like smoke. She had said it, the truth, plain and simple, and there was no going back. The meeting dragged on, but it was clear that the balance of power had already shifted. Vanessa's calm, unyielding presence had stripped away the thin veneer of control that Greg and the others had desperately clung to. As the meeting ended and the others trickled out one by one, Greg lingered, his posture stiff. "I don't think you fully understand what you're getting into," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Vanessa met his gaze, her expression cool, steady. "I understand more than you think." He said nothing more. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Vanessa alone in the room. For the first time, the office felt like it belonged to her. The power shift was complete. There would be no more pretending, no more quiet behind-the-scenes work. Vanessa had made it clear. This was her company, and anyone who didn't recognize that would have to find their place or leave. The months following Vanessa's announcement were a blur of meetings, strategies, and quiet power plays. On the outside, everything seemed to settle into a routine, but behind closed doors, the world was shifting slowly, steadily. Vanessa was no longer the overlooked manager in the background. She was the quiet force that was beginning to reshape everything. Her colleagues, though begrudgingly, had started to accept her new role. But it was never easy, never smooth. Greg, still reeling from the loss of control, tried to rally support among the more influential clients, whispering doubts about her leadership, painting her as an outsider, a bought-in figure who didn't know the ins and outs of running the company. Lisa continued her subtle campaign of undermining Vanessa, spreading rumors that Vanessa's plans were more about showing off than leading. But Vanessa didn't react. She didn't engage in petty office politics. She had no time for it. She knew that her quiet rise wasn't going to be marked by dramatic speeches or confrontations. No, she was going to build her empire from the ground up, one small, deliberate move at a time. The office watched in muted awe as Vanessa worked her magic. Each day, she pulled tighter the threads she had long been weaving, slowly constructing a strategy that was both brilliant and unseen. It wasn't about flashy public victories. It was about careful, tactical steps, small changes that accumulated over time. She met with department heads one-on-one, listened more than she spoke, and offered suggestions that were met with surprise at first, then reluctant acceptance. Slowly but surely, her influence spread. Vanessa made it a point to change the atmosphere in the office. No longer was it a place where employees were seen as disposable, where workers were overworked and underappreciated. She instituted a new policy of flexibility, giving employees the chance to work remotely, providing mentorship programs, and encouraging collaboration rather than competition. Her focus wasn't just on business, it was on creating a culture. She knew that a strong company needed more than just profits. It needed a foundation built on trust, respect, and mutual growth. The bottom line would come, that much was certain. But she needed her team to believe in her. One morning, she arrived early at the office, the silence of the building enveloping her. She didn't mind the quiet, it gave her space to think. She sat down at her desk, scanning the latest quarterly reports. She was pleased with the growth she was seeing in both sales and morale, but she wasn't satisfied. There was always more to do, more to improve. Her eyes drifted to the empty chair across from her. It had once been Greg's seat, the spot he had claimed for years as the leader of the company. Vanessa allowed herself a moment of reflection. When she had taken over, there had been uncertainty. There had been doubt. People had questioned her methods, her leadership style, and her ability to lead a company that had been shaped by others for so long. But now, as she stared at that empty chair, she realized something. There was no longer any doubt. Not in her. Not in the company. She had done it. It had taken years of careful, quiet work, of learning the ropes, of understanding the inner workings of the company. She had strategically built her influence, not by demanding it but by earning it. She had invested in the future, taking risks that no one else saw. Slowly, methodically, she had turned the tide. And the best part? No one had seen her coming. In the months that followed, Vanessa worked tirelessly, always in the background, always moving forward. She wasn't interested in public displays of power or asserting dominance. Her power wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her empire was built on small shifts, on quiet victories. The office began to change without anyone realizing it. People didn't just respect her, they started to trust her. She was the one who fixed problems before they became crises, the one who stepped in when things fell apart and quietly put them back together. The rumors that had swirled around her when she first took over began to fade, replaced by respect. Mark had all but disappeared from the office, his attempts to rally a following completely unsuccessful. Lisa, too, had been quieted, her subtle attempts to undermine Vanessa's position falling flat. People weren't interested in backstabbing or gossip anymore. They were more concerned with the company's success than petty rivalries. Vanessa spent her evenings looking over spreadsheets, crafting strategies for the future. She had long since stopped caring about the constant need for external validation. Her success was her own. She didn't need anyone else to tell her she had done well. The results spoke for themselves. Still, there were moments when Vanessa felt the weight of the position she had earned. The decisions she made now had consequences, and they were far more significant than the smaller, personal victories she had once celebrated. But she had grown into the role. She understood the responsibility it carried, and she didn't shy away from it. There were moments of doubt, of course, those small, nagging voices in the back of her mind that tried to convince her she wasn't enough. But she had learned to silence them, to replace them with the quiet confidence that had always been there, beneath the surface. One day, a client called someone who had been difficult to work with in the past. They had been hesitant about Vanessa's leadership, concerned about the direction the company was heading under her. But now, months later, their tone was different. "Vanessa," the client began, his voice gruff but respectful. "I've got to say, I didn't think you had it in you, but you've turned this company around. I'm impressed." The words caught her off guard for a moment. She wasn't used to hearing compliments. But as the conversation continued, Vanessa realized something profound. This was the first time in years that she had been truly seen. She hadn't just done the work. She had earned the respect of the people who had doubted her. "I'm glad to hear that," Vanessa said softly. "We're just getting started." She hung up the phone, staring at the screen for a moment. She wasn't just building a company anymore. She was building a legacy. Her empire was growing, quietly and steadily, just as she had always intended. As Vanessa looked out of her office window that evening, watching the sun set behind the skyline, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The world outside was as chaotic as ever, people rushing about, life moving too fast, but she didn't need to keep up. She had learned something important over the past months. The true power didn't lie in rushing forward. It lay in the quiet patience, in the ability to remain still when everyone else was scrambling. The company had transformed, and so had she. She had built it all on her own terms. She had waited, watched, and built something that would outlast them all. And in that quiet moment, as the office hummed around her, Vanessa Carter finally felt like she had earned her place at the table. Not by fighting for it, not by demanding it, but by quietly, steadily building it herself. The day Vanessa had been waiting for had finally arrived. It was one of those crisp, clear mornings that seemed to hold the promise of something important, something life-changing. The sky outside her office was a flawless blue, and she could hear the faint hum of the city below, busy as always, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She had spent the last few days preparing for this moment. It had to be perfect. She had already secured her position. There was no longer any question of whether she belonged at the top of the company. She knew she did. The work was done. The strategy was set. But today was about something bigger. Today was about revealing who she was and what she had built. The meeting was scheduled for noon, right after lunch. It was prime time, a moment when people were more likely to be distracted, their minds a little more relaxed. That would work in her favor. She didn't want this to feel like a battle. She wanted it to feel like a natural progression, like a truth that had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. Vanessa stood in front of the full-length mirror in her office, adjusting the collar of her blouse. Her reflection looked back at her. Tired eyes, but determined, strong. She hadn't gotten to this place by pretending to be someone she wasn't. She had done it by being herself, by staying steady, by focusing on the long-term vision. The face in the mirror wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was all she needed. As she straightened her shoulders, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway. Claire, her assistant, appeared at the door, a polite knock echoing softly before she stepped in. "Vanessa, the meeting's ready. They're all gathered in the conference room." Vanessa nodded, a calm smile on her lips. "Thank you, Claire." She felt no nerves. Not anymore. The hardest part was over. She had fought her way through the doubts, the whispers, and the obstacles. Now, she was just walking into a room of people who had underestimated her at every turn, ready to show them what they had failed to see. The conference room was a sea of faces as Vanessa stepped through the door. Mark, Lisa, and Greg were already sitting at the long, polished table, looking tense, their eyes shifting toward her as she entered. There was a sharpness in the room, a quiet energy that Vanessa knew all too well. It wasn't just the usual corporate tension, it was fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of her. They weren't expecting this. They had no idea what she was about to reveal. Vanessa took her seat at the head of the table. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic pause. She simply sat down, pulled a folder from the table, and began to review the documents inside, as if this was just another meeting. Her colleagues exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening, but she didn't acknowledge them. The room was still for a few moments, the silence stretching out uncomfortably. Finally, it was Mark who spoke, trying to break the tension. "So, Vanessa, we're here to talk about the new direction of the company, right? Any big changes in mind?" Vanessa didn't respond right away. Instead, she carefully set the papers down in front of her, locking eyes with each of them in turn. She could see the anxiety in their faces, especially Greg's, his stiff posture betraying his discomfort. Vanessa could almost hear the thoughts running through their minds. What's going on? Why isn't she saying anything? Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice low but steady. "You all have been wondering about the future of this company, about my leadership, about the direction I want to take us in. The truth is, this company has already changed. It's been changing for months. And today, I'm here to show you why." Mark shifted in his seat. "What do you mean by that?" Vanessa's lips curved into a small smile. "I mean exactly what I said. The company's changed. The real question is whether or not you can keep up with it." She could see the realization dawning in their eyes, but none of them spoke. The room had grown still again, every pair of eyes on her as she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single piece of paper. She laid it down on the table in front of her, and for a moment, she let the silence settle in. The paper was simple. It wasn't anything grand or elaborate. It was a legal document, the kind that most of them would never have thought to look for. But Vanessa knew it would have the impact she wanted. Lisa's eyes widened as she looked at the paper. It was a deed, simple, clean, and final. "This is the deed to the company," Vanessa said, her voice unshakable. "I've been the true owner all along." A moment of stunned silence followed her words. Then, Mark's voice broke through, a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "What the hell do you mean you're the owner? We've all been in this together. This isn't how business works. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Vanessa interrupted, her tone cutting through the noise. "You've all been playing the game with the rules you created. But I'm not playing by your rules anymore. This company, this entire operation, it belongs to me. I've been running it behind the scenes for years. The acquisitions, the investments, the strategic moves, everything you thought was someone else's idea, it was mine." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between Vanessa and the document. "You can't just come in here and—" "I already did," Vanessa said, her gaze unflinching. "The truth is, none of you ever saw me for what I was. You thought I was just a manager, a background player. But I've been building this company, and now it's mine. All of it." There was no outrage in her voice, no anger. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about the quiet power of truth. Vanessa had always been in control. The only difference now was that she wasn't hiding it anymore. For a moment, there was no sound in the room, no movement. It was as though time itself had paused, and Vanessa could see the wheels turning in their minds. Those who had once mocked her, who had written her off as nothing more than a quiet worker in the background. And now they were looking at her differently. They were looking at her as the one who had always held the power. Finally, it was Lisa who spoke, her voice tinged with an almost imperceptible tremor. "So what now?" "Possible. We're going to turn this company into what it was always meant to be. Something we can all be proud of. But if you can't get behind that vision, then you'll have to find your place elsewhere. Because this is my company now. And I'm not going anywhere." Vanessa stood up slowly, her posture straight and proud. The others remained seated, frozen in the moment. She walked toward the door, turning back once to look at them, each of them still processing the truth she had just dropped into their laps. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's about doing what's right. And now, I'm going to do it." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving them behind. The door clicked shut. Section 7. What they didn't know. The office buzzed in a different way the following days. Vanessa could feel the shift with each passing hour. Whispers in the hallways, confused glances from the few who had once doubted her. Everyone was talking, but no one knew what to say. It wasn't just that she had surprised them. It was the realization that they had never truly known her at all. They hadn't seen her potential, hadn't understood the depth of her influence. She walked the halls with her head held high, the weight of the announcement still fresh in everyone's minds. But Vanessa wasn't just carrying the power of ownership on her shoulders. She was carrying something more profound. It was the weight of years of hidden work, of decisions made in silence, of power slowly accumulating, unnoticed until it had reached the tipping point. She didn't mind the silence. In fact, she preferred it. The calm before the storm was always the most telling. And as the days passed, Vanessa could feel the storm brewing. A quiet one, gathering strength in the hearts of her employees, in the whispers of her colleagues. They didn't know it yet, but they had all just been players in her game. One late afternoon, as the office was winding down, Vanessa received a phone call. It was from her accountant, someone who had been with her since the early days of her quiet rise. They had always kept her investments under the radar, avoiding the public eye, knowing that the moment the world discovered the full extent of her wealth, things would change. But now it seemed the time had come. "Vanessa, you need to see this," her accountant said, urgency in his voice. "Your portfolio's hit a new high. I don't think you realize just how big this is. The market's been responding to your moves. It's like they knew you had something they didn't." Vanessa's mind raced as she listened, her gaze drifting out of her office window. She had spent years building this, her wealth, her influence, her position, but it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about proving that she belonged in a world that had never believed she was capable. "I've always known," Vanessa replied quietly, the weight of the moment settling over her. "But they didn't." Her accountant laughed on the other end of the line, but Vanessa wasn't focused on the humor. She was focused on the shift happening around her. Everything was changing, and it wasn't just the company. It was the entire world she had once been a part of. The world that had underestimated her. "I'll be in to see you tomorrow," her accountant said. "We need to talk about your next move. You're not just a player anymore, Vanessa. You're the game changer." The next morning, Vanessa walked into her office with a newfound sense of purpose. She hadn't been driven by anger, by revenge, or by the need to prove herself. She had done all of that quietly, behind the scenes, letting her actions speak louder than words ever could. But now, as she looked at her reflection in the glass door of her office, she knew that the next step wasn't just about leadership. It was about legacy. It was time for the world to see her for what she truly was. Not just the quiet employee, not just the overlooked manager, but the woman who had built something lasting. Her office was empty now, save for her team of trusted allies. Claire was already sitting at her desk, typing away, while Jamil and Dana were having a quiet conversation in the corner. Vanessa stood at the door for a moment, observing them without being noticed. It had always been this way, hadn't it? She had always been the one in the background, the one people overlooked. But not anymore. Now, when people looked at her, they saw strength. They saw someone who had not just risen but had built her empire from the ground up. And the best part? They still didn't know the full extent of it. The phone rang again, and Vanessa picked it up without hesitation. It was Claire. "Vanessa, we've got a situation. Mark's trying to rally the department heads. He's got some of them questioning your direction. Again." Vanessa felt a flicker of irritation, but she quickly shut it down. This was nothing new. Mark had always been one to stir the pot, to keep things unsettled. It was his way of holding on to control. But it wasn't his company anymore. "Let him," Vanessa replied, her voice calm. "Let him rally whoever he can. It doesn't matter. The work speaks for itself. The results will speak for themselves." She knew this wasn't the end of Mark's attempts to undermine her. She had always known that. But the more he fought, the more he tried to play his old games, the more the truth would become clear. People were starting to realize that they had been wrong all along. Vanessa sat back in her chair, staring at the large, empty conference table in her office. It wasn't empty for long. Soon, she would be the one filling it, leading the charge, steering the ship. Her eyes wandered to the stack of papers on her desk, the plans for the company's future. New partnerships, acquisitions, new hires that would bring fresh perspectives. She would take it all. She wasn't going to stop now. The company would thrive because of the foundation she had already laid. And when Mark's last attempt to discredit her finally faded into the background, she would be there, standing tall, quiet but unyielding. Her legacy would speak louder than any words ever could. The following week, Vanessa called for another all-staff meeting. The room was filled with anxious energy, a mix of confusion and excitement. The company had been through so much in such a short period of time, and no one quite knew where the next step would lead. Vanessa stood at the front of the room, a soft smile on her face, her posture relaxed yet confident. "I know there's been a lot of change lately," she began, her voice warm but firm. "I've been quiet for a long time, working behind the scenes, making decisions that were for the long-term health of this company. But now it's time to be open with all of you. This company is about to take a huge step forward, and I'm proud to say that we're going to do it together." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle. "We're not just here to survive. We're here to thrive. And I need each of you on board with that. I need you to trust the process, trust that the work we've done together will pay off. This is our time. And I'm not going to let anyone, inside or outside this company, undermine what we've built." The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, heads began to nod. People began to shift in their seats, their discomfort easing as they realized the truth. The company was in good hands. Vanessa's hands. Vanessa had always known the truth. They had underestimated her. And now they were about to see the power of her vision. The morning after the all-staff meeting, the atmosphere in the office felt different. It wasn't just the hum of the fluorescent lights or the sound of keyboards clicking. It was the quiet shift that had been happening ever since Vanessa had announced her position as the owner. The undercurrent of unease that had lingered for so long, the tension that had simmered just beneath the surface, had finally started to subside. Vanessa could feel it in the air. There was a sense of clarity now, a collective realization that change wasn't just inevitable, it was here. The company had been living in the shadow of past leaders who had never truly understood its potential. But now it was hers. As the weeks went on, Vanessa didn't waste time settling into the role of the quiet, unseen leader. She didn't need to prove herself with grand gestures. The power she held wasn't in the flashy presentations or the showy office politics. It was at work. It was in the trust she had slowly but surely earned, and in the results that were already beginning to speak for themselves. Her first few weeks as the official owner had been an exercise in patience. She didn't rush to shake things up. She already knew that the foundation she had built was solid. She just needed time for the change to sink in, for her team to fully realize the shift in power, the shift in direction. And as the days passed, it became clear that the changes were already taking hold. Her department heads were beginning to look to her for guidance, not in the way they had looked to the previous leadership for answers, but with respect. They had stopped questioning her authority. In fact, they had started to come to her with solutions instead of problems. That was the moment Vanessa knew she had won them over. Not through force or pressure, but through calm, unyielding leadership. Vanessa sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing the monthly reports when Claire knocked gently at the door. "Vanessa, there's someone here to see you," she said, a slight hesitation in her voice. "It's Greg." Vanessa had expected him to come around eventually. Greg was one of those people who couldn't accept defeat without a fight. He had spent the better part of his career undermining anyone who threatened his position, and Vanessa knew he wasn't one to back down quietly. Still, she didn't mind. She wasn't looking for revenge. What she wanted was to solidify her place. Not by pushing Greg further down, but by showing him that she was what the company needed, even if he couldn't see it at first. "Send him in," Vanessa replied, setting down the papers and sitting up straighter in her chair. The power dynamics in the room had shifted long ago, but this moment would solidify it. Greg entered the room hesitantly, his usual confident stride replaced by a slightly slower gait. His suit, though impeccably tailored, seemed a little too tight today, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Vanessa," he greeted her stiffly, then cleared his throat as he took a seat across from her. "I've been meaning to come by. I think we need to talk about the direction of the company. Things are moving too fast." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Moving too fast?" she asked, her voice steady. "I thought we've been moving steadily for years. Just because it's moving in a direction you didn't expect doesn't mean it's moving too fast." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, I'm not here to fight you, but I think we need to have a conversation about the long-term viability of this shift. You're making decisions quickly, and some people are starting to question whether this is the best course for everyone." Vanessa leaned forward, her gaze focused and calm. "Greg, I've been building this company for years, quietly, strategically. You saw me as someone in the background, someone who didn't matter. You and everyone else ignored what I was doing, how I was shaping the future. Now you want to come in and question the decisions I've made." He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, knowing that every word he said would be scrutinized. Greg had underestimated Vanessa from the start. He had assumed that, like the others, she would fall into the shadows, content to follow the path laid out for her. But he had misjudged her completely. She wasn't the quiet follower anymore. She was the leader, and it was time for him to understand that. Vanessa continued, her voice never rising but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. "The future is already here, Greg. I'm not going to apologize for moving us forward. The company is changing for the better. The employees are already seeing that. You've been stuck in the past, holding on to old ways, and that's why you're struggling to keep up." Greg stared at her for a moment, a mixture of frustration and grudging respect flickering in his eyes. "I never thought you had it in you," he muttered almost to himself. Vanessa stood up slowly, walking around the desk. "I didn't do this for you to think anything of me. I did it because it's what's best for the company. You can keep fighting it or you can get on board. The choice is yours." Greg sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He was a man who had always thought he controlled the narrative. He had built his career on his ability to manipulate others, to get them to believe in his vision. But now, he saw that Vanessa's vision was something he couldn't control, something he could no longer undermine. With a sigh, he stood up, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice quieter than before. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You've really changed the game, Vanessa. I'll give you that." Vanessa nodded, not needing to say anything more. "Good," she said simply, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Now, let's make sure this company changes with it." As the door clicked shut behind Greg, Vanessa took a deep breath. There was no satisfaction in his defeat, no joy in proving him wrong. It wasn't about that. It was about the company, the people who had been with her from the start, and the future she was building brick by brick. She sat back down in her chair, her hands resting on the arms of the seat, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle in. She wasn't just holding a title. She was holding the future of something far greater than herself. The power had shifted, no one could deny that now. But the true test would come in the months to follow, when the pressure to maintain her vision would be relentless, when people would look to her for guidance and leadership, when the weight of every decision would grow heavier. But Vanessa was ready for it. She had always been ready, and she wasn't going anywhere. It had been a few months since Vanessa's revelation, and the ripple effects of her quiet rise had finally begun to take shape in ways that were impossible to ignore. The days that had once felt suffocating with tension now seemed to breathe with a new energy, a new direction. Vanessa was no longer just the leader in name. She had proven herself not just to the company, but to herself as well. The office was buzzing, but not with the usual gossip and whispers of power struggles. The air was filled with a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Colleagues who had once dismissed her, avoided eye contact, or actively undermined her now nodded in greeting as she passed by. Some even smiled, though it was a cautious kind of smile, one of recognition, but still unsure if the ground they were walking on was as firm as it seemed. Vanessa didn't mind the cautious smiles. She had learned a long time ago that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, slowly, painstakingly, over time. And that's exactly what she had done. She hadn't fought for it. She had simply kept moving forward, focused on the long-term vision, building trust and quietly taking the reins. And now she could feel the shift, the real one, the one that mattered. The transformation wasn't just in the company's growth. It was in the way people looked at her. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The work spoke for itself. That Friday afternoon, Vanessa sat in her office, reviewing a series of new proposals from the departments. It was the kind of paperwork she had been doing for years, tracking progress, analyzing budgets, making sure everything was in line with her vision. But today felt different. Today, she didn't just see numbers and reports. She saw a future. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Claire. "Vanessa, there's someone here to see you. He says it's important." Vanessa glanced at the clock. It was already late, and most people had left for the day. She hadn't expected any visitors. "Who is it?" "It's Greg," Claire replied. "Greg?" Vanessa felt a shift in her chest. The last time she'd seen Greg was at the meeting after her announcement. He had left with a sense of defeat, but this was different. She had expected him to either try to undermine her further or fade into the background. She hadn't expected him to come to her. But then again, things had been different since that moment. "Send him in," Vanessa said, standing up and smoothing her blouse. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready for whatever came next. Greg entered the room a moment later, his posture stiff, his usual confidence replaced with an air of humility. He had changed. There was no denying it. His eyes were tired, but his face had softened, and there was no hint of the arrogance that had once characterized him. "Vanessa," he began, his voice low. "Can we talk?" Vanessa nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Of course, Greg. Have a seat." He hesitated for a moment, then sat down slowly, his hands resting on his lap, his fingers fidgeting slightly. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, like he was struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," he began, his voice trailing off. "I won't lie to you. I didn't see this coming, and I didn't respect you the way I should have. I thought you were just, I don't know, someone who wouldn't make it. I was wrong." He paused, as if the words themselves carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. "I've watched how you've handled things, how you've turned the company around, and I've realized that I've been fighting the wrong fight." Vanessa sat back in her chair, her expression calm, giving him space to continue. "Greg," she said quietly, "you don't have to apologize. It's not about that." "I know it's not," Greg replied, his eyes meeting hers with an honesty that wasn't there before. "I'm not apologizing just for what happened. I'm apologizing for the way I underestimated you, for the way I thought I had control. You were right all along. You built this company, and I was blind to it." Vanessa smiled slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth in his words. She had always known she'd be the one to carry the weight of the company's future. But it wasn't about fighting Greg's battles. It was about doing what was right for the people who had trusted her and for the company that had been built, brick by brick, over the years. "You don't have to carry the weight of that, Greg," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've got your own journey to walk now, but I appreciate that you're here. That's the first step." Greg's expression softened, and for a moment, it was as though the years of tension between them didn't matter. They both knew the past couldn't be erased, but it could be acknowledged. And maybe that was the key to moving forward. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Greg continued. "I just wanted to say, I see it now. I see what you've built. I see who you really are, and I can respect that. I'm not going to stand in your way anymore." Vanessa nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Greg. That means more than you know." The air between them shifted at that moment. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it didn't need to be. It was enough that Greg had recognized her strength. Team members, the tension was still there, but now it was different. They weren't questioning her authority. They were following her lead. "Today, I want to talk about the future," Vanessa began, her voice steady, carrying the weight of everything she had worked for. "We've made it through the hardest part, the transition. Now it's time to grow. It's time to expand. And it's time to bring in new ideas." She paused, looking around the room at the faces that had once doubted her. Some still wore expressions of uncertainty, but there was a flicker of trust in their eyes now. They had seen the changes, felt the shift. They knew they were on the right path. "I'm not just here to lead this company. I'm here to help each of you succeed," Vanessa continued. "We're going to build something that lasts, but we're going to do it together." For the first time since she had taken over, the room felt like a team again. The walls that had once separated her from the others were coming down, piece by piece. The respect wasn't just in the words anymore. It was in their actions, their eyes, the way they now looked to her for guidance. As the meeting ended, Vanessa lingered by the door for a moment, watching her team file out. There was no applause, no grand gestures, but that was fine with her. She didn't need them. She had built this from the ground up, quietly, steadily, and now the future was hers to lead. And for the first time, she felt like she belonged. Not just in the company, but in the world she had created. It was hers. It had always been hers. The days after the board meeting were filled with a quiet kind of energy. There were no sudden bursts of triumph, no overwhelming moments of victory. Vanessa had learned long ago that the greatest achievements often came with the least fanfare. She wasn't looking for applause. She had no desire for accolades. She had built this company, and now it was time to shape its future. Not by grand gestures, but through deliberate, consistent actions. She spent her days moving from one meeting to the next, listening more than speaking, guiding when needed, and always focusing on the long-term goals. Her colleagues, those who had once doubted her, those who had whispered behind her back, now sought her guidance. The transformation wasn't just in the company. It was in them too. They had begun to see that her quiet strength wasn't a weakness, but a foundation they could all rely on. Vanessa's influence spread through every corner of the company, and the changes she had implemented were starting to take root. The new hires were excited, eager to contribute to something bigger than themselves. The culture she had fostered, one of respect, growth, and collaboration, was becoming the company's beating heart. The work environment had shifted from one of silent resentment to one of shared ambition. People worked together not just for the paycheck, but for the future they were now building with Vanessa at the helm. One Thursday afternoon, as the office slowly emptied out, Vanessa sat alone in her office, a rare moment of stillness settling over her. She stared at the city below, the bright lights casting long shadows over the streets. The company had grown stronger with every passing day, but there was still so much to do. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Claire. "Vanessa, I just got a call from the bank. They said the latest acquisition deal went through. We're officially expanding into the West Coast." Vanessa smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. This was the moment she had been working for, the moment that marked the beginning of something even bigger. The expansion was a monumental step forward, one that would solidify her leadership and the company's place in the industry. But as she sat back in her chair, she realized something. The growth wasn't just about the financials or the market share. It was about the lives she was impacting, the people she had brought along with her on this journey. The trust they had placed in her had transformed the company, yes, but it had also transformed her. She had always been an underdog, the one no one thought would succeed. But now she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. She had created something meaningful, something that would endure. That evening, as Vanessa walked out of her office for the last time that week, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The office was quieter now, the lights dimming as her colleagues filtered out for the night. But this was just another day in the journey she was building. She had done the work, and she was going to keep doing it because, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. She passed by the break room, where a few employees were laughing, chatting casually. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was a significant one. This was the kind of environment she had always wanted to create. One where people felt comfortable, valued, and connected. The kind of place where collaboration wasn't just encouraged, it was natural. As she stepped out into the parking lot, the cool night air greeted her. And for a moment, Vanessa stood still, looking up at the stars. She had reached the top, but she wasn't done yet. The future stretched out before her like an open road, full of possibilities. She didn't need to know exactly where it would lead. She knew the journey itself was enough. That night, Vanessa went home to a quiet apartment, her mind still working through the details of the day. She had been running the company for months now, but there was still so much ahead, so much more to do. She knew that there would be challenges ahead. There would be moments of doubt, of pressure, of obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But Vanessa had already faced the hardest battles, overcoming self-doubt, fighting for recognition, and proving that she was worthy of the power she now held. And she had won. The woman who had once been ignored in the meetings, the one who had been dismissed as just another cog in the machine, was now the one who made the decisions. She had built something real, something that would last, and she was ready to keep building. As Vanessa sat down to her dinner, the quiet of her apartment felt like the perfect end to a long day. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The road ahead was hers to carve, and she had every intention of making it hers. She smiled softly to herself, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the city hummed, alive with possibilities. But Vanessa wasn't thinking about the city. She was thinking about the future she had built. A future that was just beginning to unfold. Her legacy was no longer just a dream. It was real, and she was going to make sure it lasted.